Most countries that gained independence in the mid-20th century are still struggling. Civil wars, military coups, currency collapses, decades lost to corruption and mismanagement. That is the story for a large percentage of the post-colonial world. Malaysia had every reason to follow that same path. A population split across three major ethnic groups with no shared history of living as one nation. An economy built on two volatile commodities. No oil wealth to fall back on in any serious way. And in 1969, an actual ethnic riot that came dangerously close to tearing the country apart. And yet, Malaysia did not collapse. It did not fracture. It became one of the most stable, fastest-growing economies in Asia. Here is the controversial part. This did not happen by accident, and it did not happen through free market magic either. It happened because of a series of deliberate, sometimes heavy-handed, often debated government decisions. Decisions that, if you propose them in most Western democracies today, would spark outrage. So today, we're going to walk through the specific government choices that built modern Malaysia. Some of them were brilliant. Some of them were ethically uncomfortable. All of them were consequential. And by the end, you will understand why the relationship between government power and national development is far more complicated than most people want to admit. Let's get into it. Let's start with the most controversial choice on this entire list. After the 1969 riots, the Malaysian government concluded that economic inequality between ethnic groups was not just unfair, it was a national security threat. If the Malay majority remained poor while the Chinese minority controlled the economy, the country would never be stable. Their solution was the new economic policy of 1971, and it was aggressive. Quotas for Malay students in universities, preferential access to government contracts and business licenses for Malay-owned companies, government-linked investment vehicles designed specifically to grow Malay corporate ownership. In any Western democracy, a policy explicitly distributing opportunity by race would trigger immediate legal challenges and political collapse. In Malaysia, it became the foundation of 4 decades of governance. Was it fair to the Chinese and Indian communities who built much of Malaysia's early economy? That is a legitimate and ongoing debate inside Malaysia itself. And we're not going to pretend there's a clean answer. But here is what the government got right, strategically. It did not destroy the existing economy while redistributing it. Chinese businesses were not seized. Chinese entrepreneurs were not expelled, unlike what happened in several other post-colonial nations that pursued aggressive nationalization. The government grew the pie while changing how it was sliced. That is an uncomfortable kind of political genius. Controversial in its method, effective in its outcome. Here is a choice that looks obvious in hindsight, but was genuinely risky at the time. In the 1970s, many newly independent nations across Africa and Asia were doing the opposite of what Malaysia chose to do. They were nationalizing foreign industries, expelling colonial-era businesses, and building closed, self-sufficient economies in the name of independence and national pride. Malaysia's government looked at that trend and rejected it. Instead, it opened the door wide to foreign investment. It created free trade zones with minimal taxation. It offered political and regulatory stability that multinational corporations craved. And it specifically targeted electronics manufacturing as an industry to build around. This was a politically risky choice. Inviting foreign corporations to dominate key industries, just years after gaining independence from foreign colonial rule, could easily have been framed by political opponents as a betrayal of the very independence Malaysia had just fought for. But the government held its position. Intel, Motorola, and dozens of other multinational firms set up operations across Penang and Selangor. By the 1980s, electronics had become Malaysia's largest export sector. The government bet that economic pragmatism would outperform economic nationalism. And the bet paid off in a way that transformed the country's entire trajectory. This next decision is, to this day, one of the most debated economic choices in modern Asian history. When the 1997 Asian financial crisis hit, the standard playbook was simple. Go to the International Monetary Fund. Accept their bailout. Accept their conditions, austerity, interest rate hikes, capital market liberalization. Thailand did it. Indonesia did it. South Korea did it. Malaysia's government, under Mahathir Mohamad, refused. Instead, Malaysia imposed capital controls, restricting the ability of foreign investors to pull money rapidly out of the country. It pegged the ringgit to the US dollar at a fixed rate. It effectively closed the door that the IMF's preferred approach would have kept open. The global financial establishment was furious. Western economists called the move reckless, even dangerous. Some predicted it would destroy what remained of investor confidence in Malaysia. It did not. Malaysia's capital controls gave the government breathing room to stabilize the economy domestically, without the social devastation that hit other crisis-affected countries through IMF-mandated austerity. Within 2 years, Malaysia had recovered, repaid its debts, and emerged with its banking system largely intact. This was a government making a sovereign decision against enormous international pressure, betting that it understood its own economy better than outside institutions did. Controversial, defiant, and, in hindsight, largely vindicated. Here is a government choice that gets far less attention than skyscrapers and highways, but arguably mattered more than almost anything else. Malaysia invested heavily in building functioning institutions, specifically a competent and largely professional central bank. Bank Negara Malaysia became known across the developing world for its discipline and competence, particularly its handling of the 1997 crisis and its consistent management of monetary policy in the decades since. This matters more than people realize. Many resource-rich or rapidly developing nations build impressive physical infrastructure while neglecting the institutional infrastructure that actually sustains long-term economic stability. Courts that enforce contracts, central banks that resist political pressure, civil services that function with some baseline competence. Malaysia's government, particularly from the 1980s onward, prioritized institution building alongside physical construction. It was a less visible, less politically glamorous investment. Nobody puts a functioning bureaucracy on a postcard. But 4 decades later, it is one of the clearest explanations for why Malaysia avoided the kind of institutional collapse that derailed so many of its post-colonial peers. Now, let's be honest about a government choice that did not age well. For 61 years, Malaysia was governed by the same political coalition without interruption. And for a long period, that continuity genuinely helped. Consistent policy, long-term infrastructure planning, political stability, while neighboring nations dealt with coups and instability. But that same continuity eventually curdled into something else, a political culture with insufficient accountability. The 1MDB scandal, one of the largest financial corruption cases in world history, happened under a government that had grown comfortable with minimal oversight after 6 decades of uninterrupted power. Billions of dollars allegedly disappeared through a web of corruption before the system finally produced enough accountability to convict a sitting former prime minister. The government choice to prioritize stability through one-party dominance built remarkable things in its early decades. But it also created the conditions for the kind of unchecked corruption that nearly undid much of that progress. Since 2018, Malaysia has been working through the messy, unstable process of building a more genuinely competitive democracy. It has not been smooth, but it may ultimately prove to be a necessary correction to a government model that succeeded brilliantly for decades and then overstayed its usefulness. So, what do we actually learn from Malaysia's government choices? Not that authoritarian-leaning, race-based, top-down governance is a universal blueprint for success. Plenty of governments have tried similar approaches and failed badly. What Malaysia teaches us is more nuanced and more uncomfortable. Sometimes the policies that produce results are not the policies that look good on paper or that fit neatly into ideological boxes of left or right, free market or interventionist. Malaysia's government made choices that were race-conscious and market-friendly, nationalist in rhetoric and globally integrated in practice, defiant of international institutions when it mattered, but disciplined in building competent ones at home. It does not fit a simple narrative, and maybe that is the actual lesson. that successful governance requires the willingness to make specific, sometimes contradictory, sometimes controversial choices based on what a country actually needs, rather than what ideology says it should do. Malaysia did not become what it is today by accident, and it did not become what it is today through purely free, unguided market forces either. It became what it is through specific, deliberate, often controversial government choices, made by leaders who were willing to bet on their own judgment, even when the rest of the world disagreed. Some of those choices, history has vindicated. Others, Malaysia is still paying the price for and still working to correct. That is not a perfect story, but is an honest one. And it is far more useful than the simplified version most people are taught about how nations actually develop. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about government and development, hit the like button right now. It helps this kind of analysis reach more people who are tired of oversimplified takes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we break down the real decisions behind the nations and economies shaping our world. And tell me in the comments, which government choice do you think mattered most? The redistribution policy, the defiance of the IMF, or something else entirely? I'll see you in the next one.